Hello and welcome to the next of these presentations for the Introduction to Linguistics seminar. And this week we're going on to look at another aspect of phonology, and this is what actually underlines what we were looking at last week, the phoneme, and looks a bit deeper into what lies behind the phoneme. So before we make a start, let's just have a quick recap of what we said last week. We said there are these phonemes, we represent them in slash brackets, and these are mental representations, not sounds themselves. And they're subject to phonological rules which tell us how to produce them as actual sounds, or phones as they're called. Now, the phonological rules are such that they might not just relate a single phoneme to a single phone, but in different contexts we might find different ways of realizing the phoneme, and the different phones that are then connected to the same phoneme, we refer to those as allophones. But let's take a step back and consider now in more detail what the nature of a phoneme is. The idea we've been working on is that the phoneme is a unit of the phonological system. And therefore we might think of a language as being a collection of these phonemes, all individual, all distinct from each other, and then they're going to be related to their relevant phones or allophones, maybe more than two allophones related to certain phonemes, but every phoneme will have a way of being pronounced. But if that's the way things are, if that is the real way of looking at a phoneme, then the expectation is that all phonemes should be completely unconnected to each other. Therefore, we wouldn't expect, if there was a phonological rule that affects one of those phonemes, we wouldn't expect the same things to happen to other phonemes that are unconnected to each other. After all, there's nothing that can relate different phonemes. If they're all individual and unrelated, then why should any of them behave more like each other than the other phonemes? Let's see if that's actually true, however. Let's go back and have a look at our rule that we looked at last week about the phoneme t and how it gets realized in various contexts. We said that t is unreleased when it's at the end of the word, as in a word like sat, and then it gets aspirated when it's followed by a stressed vowel, as in the word tongue, and otherwise or elsewhere it gets realized as just an unvoiced t, for example when it's followed by a consonant, as in trim, or when it's followed by a non-stressed vowel, as in potato. Okay, so in that case, that's how this phoneme gets realized by these different allophones. Now let's take another sound, the p sound, and note its distribution in terms of its allophonic representation. Well, when we put this phoneme at the end of the word, it gets produced as an unreleased thing, as in sat. When it's followed by a stressed vowel, as in pong, it gets aspirated, and when it's elsewhere followed by, say, a consonant or followed by an unstressed vowel, then it gets realized as the unaspirated, just voiceless p, as in prim. Now, obviously that's very similar to what's going on with t, and so we might have more or less exactly the same rule for p as we've got for t. Moreover, if we look at the distribution of the allophones of k, we notice exactly the same thing happens. Unreleased at the end of the word, aspirated followed by a stressed vowel, and elsewhere it's just simply unvoiced. So again, we're going to need exactly the same rule to account for this distribution. Now, why would t, p, and k be subject to more or less exactly the same rule? Or we might try to sort of explain this by collapsing these three rules into one rule. Well, it looks like this, and we say that p, t, k get unreleased at the end of the word, get aspirated when followed by a stressed vowel, and they're unchanged elsewhere. Okay, but that by itself, that move, doesn't really help us. For example, it raises more questions than it actually solves. Why these phonemes, for example, should take place with this rule? Why p, t, k? Why not d and g and f and things like this? I mean, what is it about these phonemes that make them behave the same with respect to this particular rule? Moreover, we've had to, in order to make this rule, we've had to refer to something else. For example, these things like unreleased and aspirated. Okay, now what's the status of those things in the phonological system? Note, those things themselves are not phones, unlike the rules that we started with, where we said that the phoneme is realized by this phone or that phone or the allophones. Here we're saying that these things have these properties rather than being actual phones. And of course, we had to do that because otherwise, if we said that p, t, k get realized as the unreleased p or t or k or whatever, or the aspirated p, t or k, well, then we would be back to the same thing as we had started with, and there would be three different rules. So in order to try to collapse them into one rule, we've had to make use of something else, not phones. But we're now looking at features of phones or properties of phones like unreleased and aspirated, etc., etc. So if we're going to do that, it seems then that what we're going to have to do is look at these properties or features of sounds a bit more carefully. We might be able to get round this problem then, or account for the behaviour of such phonemes as p, t, k, by claiming that actually the phoneme isn't the basic unit of the phonological system, but there's something more basic than them, and that phonemes themselves are made up of these more basic elements. And the basic elements would seem to be precisely these kinds of features or properties of sounds. So, for example, we could describe the phoneme p as being an unvoiced oral stop. Okay, so it has these features of being unvoiced, of being oral as opposed to nasal, and being stops as opposed to non-stops. Okay. Now, if we view those in terms of actual features, actual elements from which this p is built up from, we could see that these kinds of elements have a particular property to them. They come in what are called binary notions. So, for example, voiced, we can either have something which is voiced or not voiced. So we can look at that as being a feature which is either plus or minus voiced. Nasality is also something which either is nasal or not nasal, so we can have plus or minus nasal. Continuant is a feature which is used to describe sounds which are produced by a continual flow of air through the oral cavity, i.e. not stops. So fricatives, for example, are going to be continuant, but again, you can have plus or minus continuant. Minus continuant, then we're going to be referring to the stops. Note, nasals would be non-continuant or minus continuant sounds, because although the airflow is continuous with a nasal, the airflow is through the nasal passage rather than the oral one, and continuant means a continuous flow of air through the oral cavity. And then we can identify in terms of its place of articulation and refer to it as being plus labial. Okay, and again, there are sounds which are not labial sounds, and they're going to be minus labial. So, using these features then, and assuming them to be the basic units of the phonological system, we can view phonemes as being collections or bundles of such features. We refer to these features as distinctive features because it's these features by which we distinguish different phonemes. Okay, so p, for example, is distinguished from other phonemes by being voiced but being non-voiced, as opposed to say b, which is voiced. It's non-nasal as opposed to m, which is nasal. It's non-continuant as opposed to, well, we don't have a bilabial fricative, but f, for example, would be something to do with lips. It would be labial. And it's also, this is labial as opposed to, say, alveolar, so it's different from t. Okay, so we use these features, plus or minus, in terms of distinguishing the phonemes from each other, and that's why we call them distinctive features. Now, the other advantage of using a feature-based system is that we can, by referring to collections of features, identify not just single phonemes, but sets of phonemes. Okay, so if you consider what have p, t, and k got in common with each other, well, clearly the labial nature of the p is what distinguishes it from t and k. But the other features are what they all have in common. They're all voiceless, they're all oral, and they're all stops. Okay, so these are the voiceless oral stops, which means they are minus voiced, minus nasal, and minus continuant. And it's that fact about distinctive features which makes them able to be used more efficiently in terms of phonological rules, because we could restate our rule that we had earlier in terms of these features. We say a phoneme, which is made up of the three features minus voice, minus nasal, minus continuant, gets unreleased when it's at the end of the word, gets aspirated when it's followed by a stressed vowel, and it's left alone elsewhere. Okay, so by using distinctive features, what we're actually doing is defining not just the phonemes themselves, but natural sets of the phonemes which group together and can be acted upon by phonological rules in a particular way. Okay, so if a phonological rule targets a set of phonemes, like this one does here, we can see that that set of phonemes is a natural set of phonemes, and therefore we would predict they all have some features in common by which we could actually identify that set. Okay, so that's the idea of a distinctive feature. What distinctive features do we actually need? Well, let's start with the vowels. They're perhaps the most simplest to see. And the kinds of features that we use to describe vowels are the kinds that we would have been talking about when we've been talking about the phonetic properties of vowels. But they've got one or two interesting observations to be made here. Okay, so the features are going to be those things listed there on the left-hand side: high, low, back, rounded, tense. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. High, well, that's fairly obvious what that is. That's going to be the close vowels, the ones that are produced by your tongue being raised to the high position in your mouth. So obviously E and I are high vowels, and U and U are high vowels. All of the others get a minus value for that one. Low vowels are ones which actually require the tongue to be pulled into a low position. Okay, that's going to be A and A or an R are supposed to be low vowels in this respect. So we can identify the high vowels and we can identify the low vowels. But what about the central vowels then? Well, those are actually identified just by using these two features, because the central vowels are going to be identified as those vowels which are neither high nor low. So those vowels which have a minus for these two features. So for example, there is minus high, minus low. It's a central vowel. So we can actually distinguish then the open and the close and the central vowels just using these two features. Back is another feature which is itself self-explanatory. We've got a distinction between back and front vowels. But note, by using this system, we don't actually distinguish between back and front, but we distinguish between back and non-front. That includes the mid vowels as well. So not just, the central vowels, not just the front vowels. So while oo, or, o, ah, and are back vowels, we've got e, and a as the front vowels. Rounded vowels, well, rounding is to do with rounding your lips, and as you can see, we can classify things as being rounded or not rounded, so plus rounded or minus rounded. Oo, o, and or are rounded vowels, as opposed to ah and and of course the front vowels are all unrounded. Now then, we finally have this tense distinction. Now the tense distinction is to do with whether you tense your tongue. In fact, it's the root part of your tongue, the tongue that's actually embedded in your jaw. Whether you tense it or whether you leave it loose, what's called a lax vowel. So tense versus lax. E is a tense vowel and I is lax. Okay, so in a sense, that's what's forcing the E to be that slight bit higher and slight bit further forward, because we're tensing the root of the tongue, and I is more relaxed, as it was, well, a lax vowel. Note, we don't have here a distinction between between long and short vowels, and that's because, by and large, that is a redundant feature. Tense is something which tends to go with the long-short distinction. So, for example, E is a tensed vowel, it's a long vowel. I is a short vowel, it's a non-tensed vowel. Same with oo and o. Okay, that same distinction between tense and lax seems to go hand in hand with length. So on the whole, we don't really need a feature to distinguish between sounds in terms of length. Okay, as you can see on the chart here, all of the vowels are represented and they all are identified as having completely different set of features, though they do overlap in terms of their features. So, for example, E and I are both plus high, they're minus most other things, but they're distinguished in terms of plus or minus tense. Let's take another pair, oo and o. They're both high, they're both back, they're both rounded, but they're distinguished in terms of, again, tense. As opposed to, let's take another set, we've got the o vowel as opposed to the o vowel. O is high, o is not high, o is lax, and o is tense. Okay, compare o to or. Okay, there we see o is high and or is not high, but or is low and o is not low. Okay, so every single vowel we can distinguish them in terms of what features they have and what value of the feature, plus or minus. Okay, now let's move on to have a look at the consonants of the system. Okay, now some of these are the same kinds of features as we've just seen with the vowels. Some of them are specific to consonants, and some of them are quite obvious as what they mean, and others I'll have to tell you just exactly what they relate to. Back and high are features that we've already seen, and again you can distinguish between consonants which are back consonants and high consonants. The back consonants are those which are produced on the velum or behind, i.e. the glottis. So all of the back consonants are velar or glottal. Okay, k, g, ng, w, and h. W, note, is considered to be a back vowel because it's produced using the tongue raised up at the back towards the velum. Okay, w is not just a bilabial sound, it's also a velar sound, so it gets a plus for the back feature here. The high consonants are those which are used by raising your tongue into the space in the towards the roof of your mouth. So these are not going to be the things which are produced further forward, where the roof of your mouth actually drops down towards your teeth. Okay, so it starts basically at the post-alveolar with the sh and j sounds, and the palatal y and r, and the velar k, g, ng, w, but not this time the glottal h, because with h your tongue is actually pulled down, so it's not a high vowel. Coronal. Coronal sounds are produced using the blade of your tongue. Okay, remember the tongue is split into three areas: the tip, the blade, and the back of the tongue. The coronal sounds then are the ones that are produced using the blade. So something like th or the, t and d. These are all the alveolars and dentals where the blade of your tongue is actually touching those particular areas. N as well, s, z. Okay, the alveolar sounds basically are coronal. Anterior sounds are produced at the front of your oral tract. That is anything from the post-alveolar and palate forward. So obviously the alveolar, the teeth, and the lips are all anterior sounds. Things including the velum are not anterior; they're minus. Labial, well, that's self-explanatory, so any sound that makes use of the lips is going to be plus labial. Note w is also included in the labials because it is both a velar and a labial at the same time. Continuance, well, we've already mentioned that. That involves a flow of air through the oral cavity as opposed to a stop sound. So all the fricatives are continuants. But so too are the things like the approximants and so the approximants and the liquids. So things like l and sh and r and y are continuants. Lateral, well, we know what lateral is. Lateral is where the tongue is in such a shape that the airflow is around the outsides of it, and we only have one lateral sound. Therefore, this feature is a very kind of unique feature to that l phoneme. Nasal, I don't think we need to say anything about that. Voiced at the bottom, we don't need to say anything about that. But then we've got these sonorant and strident sounds. Sonorant means sort of soundy sounds. These are sounds, consonants, which have quite a bit in common with vowels. Vowels are very sonorant sounds. In fact, all vowels are sonorant, therefore we don't use that as a distinctive feature for vowels, but some consonants can act in a way that is very similar to a vowel, and we'll see this when we start looking at other aspects of phonology. The sonorants are the nasals, so m, n, and ng are all sonorants, but so too are the approximants like y and r are sonorant. W is also a sonorant. Strident sounds are hissy sounds, so sounds with high frequency. So basically we're talking about most of the fricatives here, but only those fricatives which produce this high-pitched hiss sound, so f and v and s and z. Note that h is a fricative, but it's not a sonorant. It's not a strident fricative. Okay, so that's what all these features are, the ones that we make use of in phonological rules for English. You don't really have to learn these, but you should be aware of their existence. What you really need to have got from this session here is this notion of what a distinctive feature is and how we make use of it in order to explain phonological phenomena. So let's just quickly summarize. Phonemes are units of sound system, but they're not the smallest units. There are units of the sound system which are even smaller and which build up a phoneme. These are called distinctive features. Phonemes are then seen as bundles of these features, which distinguish one phoneme from another. Distinctive features we've seen are binary features. That means they're either plus or minus, and as I said, they distinguish between the phonemes of a language. Features which are added to phones by phonological rules. For example, the plus aspiration or the plus non-released feature. These are not distinctive features because we don't distinguish phonemes on them. They are additional features added by the rules themselves, and they affect just the phones or the allophones of a language. We don't distinguish different phonemes using these. So we don't refer to, in English at least, plus or minus aspirated as being a distinctive feature. There are some languages in which it is a distinctive feature and they have phonemes which differ in terms of whether or not aspiration is used. Finally, phonological rules refer to bundles of distinctive features and therefore they work on sets of phonemes rather than individual phonemes. And that's one of the main uses of a distinctive feature. It can help us to explain why groups of phonemes behave in a similar manner to each other because it can explain what a natural set of phonemes is. Natural set of phonemes are those phonemes which share certain distinctive features. Okay, by referring to the distinctive features rather than the particular phonemes, rather than seeing phonemes as being individual units that are connected to each other just simply by accident, we can explain why groups of phonemes are connected because of the shared features that they have. Okay, that's enough, and I'll see you in class. Okay, bye.